Lecture 4, Property Rights, Institutions and Soviet Agriculture. The lectures for the 3 previous lessons combined an historical overview with the development of a single economic reasoning tool. Lesson 1 introduced opportunity cost analysis and applied it to leadership decisions from the Communist Revolution in 1917 through the Lenin and Stalin years. Lesson 2 followed Khrushchev through the 50s, explaining how the missing market incentives eventually ended the so-called golden years of the Soviet economy. Then, in Lesson 3, we used incentive analysis to look at the factory system in the USSR during the era of stagnation under Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, which took us through the 70s and early 80s. So, we're up to 1985. But before we look at the last 6 years, from Gorbachev's assumption of the premiership until the collapse in 1991, I want to go back and revisit the earlier Soviet history in order to introduce a new economic reasoning tool, institutional analysis. In terms of the social framework we've used as a context throughout these lessons, we started with the communist leadership, stepped down to the ministry, and most recently took another step down in the hierarchy to the factory directors. In this lesson, we're taking kind of a lateral step. We're still at the actual production level, but we'll shift the focus from factory to farm. The short story of Soviet agriculture is one of failure. From the very beginning, the communists struggled and failed to solve what was referred to as the food problem. The failure of agriculture is a consistent feature, decade after decade, premier after premier. It's also an ongoing demonstration of the importance of institutions and how the rules of the game shape outcomes. In this case, the institution responsible was property rights, the communists' rejection of private property being the keystone of their world vision. Strangely, the Soviet Union, the largest nation on Earth, had trouble finding space to grow food. Much of the huge land mass it encompassed was, and is, unfit for agriculture, particularly the tundra and the forests of northern Russia and Siberia. Farming was restricted to about 10% of the empire, and while 10% of a huge territory totals up to an impressively large acreage, it was further restricted by its location and, strangely, by the similarity of its climate. The grain-growing areas, including the fertile black earth belt shown in dark orange on the map on the screen, stretched in a narrow band hampered by cold and intermittent drought. As one analyst explained, the principal explanation for the comparatively large yield variations and food supply fluctuations that characterized Soviet agriculture was that the good farmland shared many similarities, meaning that the USSR didn't have the advantage of a varied agricultural environment where drought in one area might be balanced by higher yields in another. In addition to the geographic liabilities, the communists inherited the legacy of inefficient land allocation and peasant discontent from the czars. The freeing of the serfs in the mid-19th century had led to small farm plots, ill-suited to the geography and to available technology, and at odds with communist philosophy. As Lenin noted, small-scale production gives birth to capitalism and the bourgeoisie, constantly, daily, hourly, with elemental force and in vast proportions. Lenin clearly saw that the combining of farms and elimination of private land ownership should be one of the most important steps to forming the ideal communist society. But, embroiled in civil war, he decided the timing wasn't right. Instead, he made good on the Bolsheviks' revolutionary slogan, peace, land, and bread, by legally recognizing peasant seizures of land from the wealthy landowners. While Lenin didn't nationalize agriculture as he did industrial production, he did encourage collectivization trying to piggyback it on the communal farming tradition common among poorer landowners. And under war communism, he did require farmers to sell their, quote, surplus production to the state at state prices. Thus, while there was still a semblance of private property in agriculture, the peasants definitely lost their right to control and benefit from what they produced. The state requisitioning created perverse incentives, which quickly took their toll. Output fell, and peasant uprisings increased. So Lenin, ever the practical idealist, took a step backwards in order to, as he said, take 2 steps forward. In 1921, the NEP, or New Economic Policy, gave in to peasant discontent. The requisitioning of farm production was replaced by a tax. The peasants had only to turn over a fixed percentage of their output to the state, not the whole crop. Land reform, in which the estates of the wealthy were broken up and given to the peasants, was continued. Lenin called this state capitalism, arguing that it was a necessary step for preparing the peasantry for communism. Incentive analysis leads us to expect that the NEP would greatly increase agricultural output, because farmers could then benefit by growing larger crops. And it did. The famine ended, and agricultural production quickly recovered to pre-war levels. But the Soviets weren't happy with the family-oriented private agriculture that developed during the 20s, and they never abandoned the goal of collectivization. They believed it was essential to modernization, so they just delayed it. The legacy of the Tsarist period had been small plots of land separated by large boundaries of unused land. Connecting the plots into collectives not only advanced the communist vision of eliminating private property, it also served 2 practical goals: allowing more efficient, mechanized agriculture, and 2, freeing up labor to work in industry. So, Stalin allowed the NEP to continue for a brief period after Lenin's death in 1923. But from the beginning of his tenure as premier, he was moving toward collectivization. First, by showcasing the marvels of large-scale mechanized agriculture. And then, in 1928, under the 5-year plan, initiating the policy of forced collectivization. Stalin wanted surpluses from collectivized agriculture to feed the urban industrial workforce and to pay for imports of machinery and technology. We can see that he anticipated great benefits from the choice to collectivize in the output projections he made for the first 5-year plan, the improbable increases of 50% in agricultural production and 330% in industrial production. The first step in collectivization was to get rid of the kulaks. Kulak was the traditional name for the wealthier, which is not the same as wealthy, the wealthier segment of farming communities, about 5% of the rural population. The kulaks were landholders, and not surprisingly, they were most resistant to collectivization. In 1928 and 29, Stalin started a campaign of de-kulakization, rounding up the kulaks and their families and sending them to work in the forced labor camps, the gulags. Estimates of the death toll start at 6 million. With the kulaks out of the way, the next step was to move farmers onto either collectives, kolkhozy, or state farms, sovkhozy. The difference, in theory, is that members of a kolkhoz owned the non-land assets collectively, while the state owned all assets of the sovkhoz and employed the farmers as workers. In practice, it was a distinction without much difference. Stalin's propaganda wooed the peasants with the promise of better lives, and some farmers moved on to the collectives voluntarily or with little pushing, lured by the promise of mechanization. One historian argues that the American Fordson tractor sent on demonstration runs was the best propaganda for collectivization. Most farmers moved, however, because they perceived no other viable option. Throughout the collectivization process, even as overt resistance was quashed, covert resistance continued. One common form was the slaughter of livestock, the peasants preferring to eat their animals rather than give them to the state. Collectivization was accompanied, predictably, by a decline in output between 1929 and 1932, and famine in rural areas. Stalin responded with what has been called the terror famine, setting impossibly high quotas in resistant areas like the Ukraine, and reducing food rations to the non-compliant. Again, the estimates are of an additional 5 million plus deaths. Nonetheless, the elimination of private property proceeded. By 1936, 90% of agriculture was collectivized in the original Soviet Union, and after World War II, Stalin extended collectivization into the satellite nations. Khrushchev continued to collectivize in the 50s, and he was an ardent proponent of the bigger is better philosophy. Although he was less brutal than Stalin, perhaps he didn't have to be, since the empire was virtually 100% collectivized when he came to power, his vision, though, was no less grandiose. In 1954, he initiated the Virgin Lands policy to cultivate the remote steppes of Kazakhstan. A huge propaganda campaign moved more than 300,000 people to unpopulated Central Asia to farm almost 500,000 square kilometers of wheat. The first harvest in 1956 was spectacular, producing on 1/8 of the Soviet farmland over 1/2 the total grain output. After the initial cheering died down, however, the short-sightedness of the venture began to show itself. By the 1960s, the soil was exhausted, and although the USSR produced fertilizer, the beleaguered system couldn't get it to the Virgin Lands. The farms were extremely remote, and getting laborers there for the harvest was difficult, as was transporting food grown in the Virgin Lands back to the cities. Crops rotted in the fields. Without erosion control, the topsoil blew away, and the land quickly degenerated. In the end, the Virgin Lands campaign became another ephemeral Soviet triumph, not to mention another humiliation for Khrushchev, who had boasted that the Soviet Union would outstrip U.S. agricultural production. Somewhat paradoxically, the solution to the farm problem began to show itself under Khrushchev too. In the gradual resurgence of the traditional back-stoop private household plots, where peasants grew crops for sale in local unsanctioned markets. Stalin had cracked down on the plots, but Khrushchev turned a blind eye, either deliberately or just too preoccupied to notice, or perhaps because it became clear that they lessened the pressure of continued food shortages, which had been made worse when Khrushchev rescinded Stalin's ban on peasants leaving the farms to join the urban workforce. The factories gobbled up the young farmers and increased the need for food and reduced the rural workforce, a double whammy. So, while Khrushchev certainly wasn't going to promote the incentives that motivated the garden plots, he also had no strong incentive to work actively to eliminate them. When Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev, nothing changed. No surprise there. He agreed with Khrushchev that bigger is better, so he continued combining the farms, arguing that it would increase productivity. But he also hedged his bets by increasing the state investments in agriculture to an all-time high of 27% of GDP by the mid-1970s. Output did increase, but not at the necessary rate. Grain imports were ongoing, livestock output continued to be hampered by insufficient fodder, and in addition to the wheat problems, the production of other export staples like sugar beets began to fall. Infrastructure deficiencies weren't addressed, so crops continued to rot in the fields while cities suffered lines and shortages. The rural labor force continued to deteriorate as young people left to work in the cities leaving poorly educated older women as the bulk of the agricultural labor force. The garden plots also continued and grew under Brezhnev to 4% of all farmland by 1980. Who knows? Maybe tolerating the garden plots was a deliberate policy of encouragement by benign neglect, because this meager 4% unacknowledged allocation of land was responsible for fully 25% of total agricultural output. As we move toward the 80s, it's clear that the lesson of Soviet agriculture was in the garden plots, despite the Communist Party's unwillingness to learn it. Household plots also capture the lesson for this lecture. Incentives matter, and institutions, in this case property rights, shape incentives. First, a brief review of our economic tools. Remember that incentives are rewards or punishments that influence choices and shape behavior. Factory managers motivated by quotas make different choices than entrepreneurs motivated by profit. Workers with guaranteed incomes behave differently than workers who can lose their jobs. And, as we'll see, farmers who own their own land and output behave differently than farmers who work land they don't own and produce crops that aren't theirs to sell. Knowing that incentives shape behavior should prompt us to ask what sets up the incentives themselves. The answer, as we can see in economic reasoning proposition number 4, is that institutions shape incentives by defining the rules of the game. So, what about institutions? Well, first, let's get past thinking about institutions as just universities or hospitals or prisons or other such imposing buildings, which is the way we use the term in everyday conversation. In the social sciences, institutions are more processes than places. Here's a definition that's a little more useful. Institutions are the formal and informal rules of the game that shape incentives and outline expected and acceptable forms of behavior in social interaction. Under that guideline, then, a school is an institution not because it's a special building, but because we know what goes on there. It has expected and acceptable forms of behavior. When we're little and we first start school, we don't know the rules of the game, and we have to learn things like the teacher's in charge, raise your hand to speak, be on time, walk, don't run, stand quietly in line, turn in your homework. As we learn the rules, we also discover the rewards and punishments for obeying or disobeying them. Sometimes the rules are formal, laws, regulations, contracts, student behavior agreements, but more often they're not. You just have to kind of figure out what's cool and what isn't. Regardless, they all have the same purpose: to facilitate social interaction, that is, to lower the costs and increase the benefits of dealing with other people. The major institution shaping the behavior of Soviet farmers was property rights. Examining the formal and informal rules of ownership in the USSR provides us all the clues necessary to solving the ongoing mystery of agricultural failure, and to explaining one of the major cracks in the economic leg of our metaphorical stool. We don't usually stop to think of it, but ownership doesn't always mean the same thing. We don't own everything in the same way. Saying, "That's my book," isn't the same as claiming, "That's my cat," or "my bicycle," or "my baby." Okay, that's kind of obvious, but saying it out loud prompts us to try to explain how they're different. Economics clarifies the parameters of ownership by thinking of property rights as a bundle of sticks that define the privileges and limitations of ownership, use, and transfer. Privileges and limitations are the words to focus on. So, what are the privileges and limitations of your ownership of, say, your cat? Well, formally, the law specifies that you have to feed and take care of your cat. You can't abuse it or abandon it along the highway. Informally, you and your neighbors may agree not to let your cat outside in the spring when the birds are nesting. You can sell your cat, you can give it away. You can take your cat to visit nursing homes to offer comfort and companionship to sick people. Lots of privileges and few limitations on owning a cat. What about your bicycle? There are rules about where and when you can ride it. Yes, in the same lane as the cars on the streets in your town. No, on the sidewalk in the mall. You can sell it, or you can lend it, or give it away. And unlike the cat, you can even destroy it if you want to. What about the book? Well, that depends. Is it a book you purchased? A textbook issued at school? A library book? Or an e-book that you rented? Privileges and limitations, some formal, some informal. In economics and in law, the analogy of a bundle of sticks is used for categorizing those privileges and limitations. When you have all the sticks in the bundle, we say that your property rights are defined, exclusive, transferable or divestible, and defensible or enforceable. The sticks may be weak or strong, and you may have some sticks and not others, but together the bundle defines the privileges and limitations of your ownership. Okay, let's go through the categories separately. First, definition. When property rights are clearly defined, everyone knows or can find out what the privileges and limitations are. There are all sorts of formal and informal ways that property rights are defined. Go back to the bike example. It doesn't have to be a law that says you have the right to ride the bike you purchased, but that informal privilege is well understood. There may be a law, however, that says you can't ride on the street, and there may be a sign that says you can't ride on the sidewalks at the mall or the paths in the park. Property rights to bikes are usually clearly defined, but that's not true of everything. Who owns the air, for example? When property rights can't be or haven't been clearly defined, we tend to have conflicts over how a resource can and can't be used, like air. We don't have clearly defined property rights to air, and that leaves us lots of questions and potential conflicts over the privileges and limitations of use. Can I use it to dispose of pollution from my car, for example? Can the factory use it to dispose of manufacturing byproducts? Okay, the second stick in the property rights bundle is exclusivity, meaning the ability to deny others the benefits from the use of your property. There's huge variation in how exclusive people's rights are. Think of it as whether the stick is skinny or thick. For example, in some states, if you own land that includes an ocean shore, you can post no trespassing signs barring other people from using your beach. But in other states, even though you may own the beach, you can't keep other people off it, at least not up to the high tide mark. Okay, third is transferability. You can sell your cat or give it away, same with your bike. But what about your baby, your blood, your organs, your handgun? You get the point. There are limits on transferability, and they can change, either formally or informally. And finally, full property rights are defensible. If someone steals your bike, climbs your fence, denies you access to the beach, you can request that your rights be enforced or defended by the police and the courts. Another way to say this is that your rights are secured. Okay, so think about these property rights sticks in terms of Soviet agriculture. By definition, all land belonged to the state after the revolution. So farmers were using land they didn't own. Beginning with Stalin, the definition of property rights to the other farm assets, tractors, plows, buildings, even animals, varied depending on whether the farm was a collective, a kolkhoz, where the farmers owned the assets in common, or a state farm, a sovkhoz, where the state owned the assets and the farmers had only use rights. But in any case, they didn't belong to the farmers themselves, and the farmers couldn't transfer them, either by renting or selling or giving them away. What about exclusivity? Well, theoretically, there was none. Everything belonged to, quote, the people, collectively. That included the output of the farm. What happens to incentives there? As to defensibility, what was to defend? The bundle of property rights sticks for the Soviet farmer was pretty small and pretty spindly. But remember that the communists saw this as a plus. The elimination of private property was what they wanted to happen. It was a necessary step to achieving the new society. Another way to think about property ownership is in terms of control rights and benefit rights. The control rights are the privileges and limitations we talked about. The benefit rights are to the value you create from your possession using those control rights. As we have in the earlier lectures, we'll find it helpful to compare the Soviet system to the market system we're familiar with, to see how property rights function to increase output and well-being. In markets, the control rights and the benefit rights go together. In agriculture, for example, the Western farmer decides how to use or whether to transfer his land, and he claims any benefits that result from his choices. He has both control over his property and first right to the benefits he produces. In the Soviet Union, control and benefit rights were separated, and neither belonged to the farmers. The ministries and farm managers controlled the farms. The output from the farm, the benefits of ownership, belonged to the people. But again, the state was the actor in this scene, not individual farmers. Which brings us to the underlying problem. The property rights rules of the game gave farmers no claim to the output they produced, and no liability for the assets of the farm where they lived and worked. The institution of collective agriculture was the source of incentives that caused and then perpetuated the failure of Soviet agriculture. The perverse incentives of common property ownership create what is known as a free rider problem. Because farmers on the collective share equally in the benefits of the farm's production, a farmer who reduces his effort won't see a corresponding reduction in his benefits. He gets to free ride on the efforts of his fellow farmers. Well, at least until they respond to the same incentive and begin to free ride themselves. As an example, if 10 farmers working 100 hours a day produce a 10-ton crop, that's a 10-ton benefit each. But suppose one farmer on the collective disappears for 5 hours every afternoon, and total output falls to 95 tons. The farmer reduced his workload by 50%, but his benefit by only 5%. Okay, so in that atmosphere where everyone has an incentive to shirk, how do you increase production as the Soviets tried to? Well, suppose you initiate a big propaganda campaign, which was a common Soviet tactic, and the campaign gets one of the farmers all fired up, enough that he does 15 hours work a day instead of the usual 10. He's increased his cost 50%, and production does go up as a result of his effort to 105 tons. His share is now 10.5 tons, or a 5% increased benefit for a 50% increased cost. How motivating is that? And how long do you think it takes for his all fired up to turn into shirking again? Just a side note on the tragedy of the commons and recent scholarship. The Nobel Prize in 2009 was awarded to Elinor Ostrom for her work on the tragedy of the commons and her challenges to the traditional predictions of the shirking outcome, especially in an example like ours of a small communal farm with only 10 farmers. Ostrom's studies found instances where communal ownership didn't produce a tragedy of the commons, and that challenged the prevailing wisdom. But at the same time, she's confirmed the folly of the Soviets' decision to collectivize agriculture on a grand scale, because what she discovered is that the tragedy of the commons can be avoided if the community is small enough and has strong ties that eliminate the free rider problem. This may have been the case in the small communal or village farming that emerged in Russia after the end of serfdom in 1861, but it was definitely not the case for Soviet collectivization. Remember that the whole purpose, starting with Lenin and Stalin's efforts to consolidate the peasants' small fields, up through Khrushchev and Brezhnev's push for mega factory farms to take advantage of mechanization and economies of scale, was to make farms bigger, eliminating the face-to-face relationships that could have made a cooperative work. The result, then, of Soviet collectivization was a tragedy of the commons on a scale seldom seen in human history. The story is told not only in the recurring failure to solve the food problem, but in the depletion of resources, the degradation of capital, and the environmental destruction that we learned about after the regime fell in 1991. In Lecture 3, we pointed out that profit in market economies directs resources to their most highly valued uses. Clearly defined, enforceable property rights also contribute to that desirable outcome, because people take better care of things they own. When owners know that they will reap the benefits of their property, they have an incentive to preserve it and even to enhance its value, so that they can continue to benefit, or perhaps so that they can benefit by transferring that value to someone else. That incentive doesn't exist when resources are owned in common and controlled by the state. Economists also recognize that ownership incentives dissipate when ownership is collective rather than private, as recognized in the saying that if everyone owns it, it's the same as when no one owns it. Many areas of the Soviet economy suffered from the no one owns it syndrome, but it's most obvious in agriculture. After the fall of the USSR, we were able to more clearly see the overuse of farmland, including soil depletion and dramatic erosion, the deplorable condition of farm machinery and technology. Farmers had little incentive to maintain tractors, buildings, fences, and other equipment. It's kind of like the analogy of the child who replies, "It's not mine," when told to bring toys in from the rain. And there was massive pollution and environmental degradation, including even the virtual destruction of some of the largest inland lakes and seas in the world. The simplest answer to why the communists weren't able to solve the food problem is that no one owned the farms. Soviet history provides two strong pieces of evidence that the potential was there, but the institutional rules of the game kept success out of reach. First is the agricultural record under the NEP, when Lenin gave back to the farmers control of their land and ownership of most of their output. Changing the rules of the game changed the incentives, and motivated by their ability to improve their own well-being, the peasant farmers quickly returned to pre-war levels of production. The second piece of evidence is found in the garden plots, the 4% of land that by 1980 produced over 25% of food in the Soviet Union. After working on the collective all day, farmers were allowed to work small garden plots near their quarters, and this is the key, they were allowed to keep what they produced and to market it individually. So people who shirked in the field all day worked diligently on their garden plots in the evening. No surprise. This was not officially sanctioned or directed, but the party leadership knew the contribution the private garden plots made and allowed them to continue. This even as Brezhnev poured ever-increasing investment into land and capital owned in common. Because, after all, private ownership didn't fit the vision of the communist future. While our focus in this lesson has been on agriculture, that's not the only place where eliminating private ownership had undesirable outcomes. Think back to Lesson 3 and the factory system. Our lesson there was about incentives, and in reality, that's the lesson here too, isn't it? In both areas of the economy, the factory and the farm, incentives encouraged behavior that at best didn't help, and at worst actually undermined efforts to increase production. In this lesson, we've shown that the source of those perverse incentives in agriculture came from institutional rules of the game that prohibited private property and mandated collective ownership. It's easier to see in the farm sector, where it contrasts so starkly with the farming tradition of private ownership that we're used to. But the lack of private property affected the industrial sector as well, and, as we'll see in Lesson 5, the behavior of people and households too. The Soviet system separated the sticks in the property rights bundle, so that while the benefits of ownership supposedly belonged to everyone equally, the state controlled the resources that the people owned. In addition to problems of the tragedy of the commons, this setup created what economists call moral hazards, that is, rewards for immoral behavior and the abuse of power. Government officials, factory directors, and farm managers could, and often did, use their power to control resources in order to gain personal benefits. Bribery and corruption were endemic, as was theft of, quote, the people's property, from factories, shops, and farms. One of the most common thefts, as we saw in our examples, was the theft of time, a resource that the government had paid for with the worker's wage, but that the worker stole through shirking and absenteeism. Looking back at our three-legged stool then, it should strike you that while the institution of collective property rights played a significant role in the deterioration of the economic leg, it also had implications for the moral-cultural leg. A society in which corruption is an expected part of daily life and deception is an accepted and expected strategy for getting ahead is a society that breeds cynicism and the simmering discontent that's threatening to bubble over as Mikhail Gorbachev takes over in 1985.